as part of this talk, I'm going to have a few bits of text, some longer than others, and a couple of them fairly complex, but that's okay. That's why they call me Coach, so that's why I'm giving a talk to unpack some of them. So I'll have a couple of slides, and they are utterly and altogether primitive. So just forgive me for the primitive nature of my slides. They're not very disco. So I want to start with this. This is a text from the 11th century by the Muslim philosopher and theologian Al-Ghazali, his work on the incoherence of the philosophers. He says this: the connection between what is habitually believed to be a cause and what is habitually believed to be an effect is not necessary, according to us. But with any two things, where this is not that and that is not this, and where neither the affirmation of one entails the affirmation of the other, nor the negation of the one entails the negation of the other, it is not a necessity of the existence of the one that the other should exist. And it is not a necessity of the non-existence of the one that the other should not exist. For example, the quenching of thirst and drinking, satiety and eating, burning and contact with fire, and so on to include all that is observable among connected things in medicine, astronomy, arts, and crafts. Their connection is due to the prior decree of God, who creates them side by side, not to its being necessary in itself, incapable of separation. This is the classic text for a view in philosophy about the God-world relation that is called occasionalism. And it is essentially this, that creatures in themselves have no real causal power, and that on the occasion, hence the name, where two things become contiguous, so let's say heat and a pot of water, that when they connect, that the water boils is not due to any causal efficacy in the fire. It is rather on the occasion God directly intervenes and makes the water boil. Now, why would Al-Ghazali say such a thing? Well, his reasons are actually quite clear. Al-Ghazali's position is in one way rooted in, we might say, a fear or a concern that if one ascribes explanations, causal explanations to creatures, then that would exclude God as a causal explanation. In other words, if we can show that a creature does it, this must mean and can only mean God doesn't do it. And if we can show God does it, that must mean that a creature does not do it. This view of the God-world relation sees divine causality and creaturely causality as essentially competing. And this is not just an interesting historical factoid. In fact, I would say that at least most of, and I'll be very generous, most of the arguments I've seen that, for example, would fall under the broad rubric of, quote, intelligent design arguments, have this kind of fear or this kind of concern or this paradigm as one of their unspoken assumptions. So what I want to do today is this. I want to look at a different perspective of the God-world relation, one that has been mentioned several times in talks. We're going to embrace the paradigm of St. Thomas. And I'm going to talk about his, we might say, theory or framework of primary and secondary causality, what primary causality is, what secondary causality is, the relation of dependency of one on the other, how you might say they interact. Then I will talk about how that cashes out in nature as purposeful and how to think about nature as purposeful from a Thomistic standpoint, which will not be an empirical scientific standpoint, but a philosophical standpoint. And we'll talk about how then chance fits into the purposeful order of nature, and then round things out by maybe putting into contact just briefly this framework that we're going to go through with something like the broad contours of a modern Darwinian picture. Okay? So first, let's talk about primary and secondary causality, and then get back to Al-Ghazali. Well, exactly what does God do on Aquinas' account? Well, as it turns out, God does everything. But God does everything by creation. For St. Thomas, creation is an uncreated divine activity, strictly speaking, an uncreated divine activity, by which God is the primary and ultimate cause of all that is, the way it is, as it is, when it is. St. Thomas contrasts this uncreated divine activity with what he calls change, which we'll see in a minute is the paradigmatic creaturely activity. Thomas conceives change, broadly speaking, as moving one being from state of being A into a new state of being B. Any sort of change one can think of. And as we'll see, this is how he characterizes the activity of creatures. But for Aquinas, these two activities are radically different. He says this: for creation is not change, but the very dependency of the created act of being upon the principle from which it is produced, and thus creation is a kind of relation, so that nothing prevents it being in a creature as its subject. For St. Thomas, for a thing to be created just means for it to have a radical dependency on God at every moment. You might say creation is the immediate, simultaneous dependency of everything for its being, for it being a being of a certain kind, a hydrogen atom, a dog, a squirrel, all over this campus. At every moment and in every execution of its activities and its causality, it depends upon God as creator. This radical dependency. For Aquinas, and this is where he actually departs from, I could rattle off a dozen people in the Eastern patristic tradition. For Aquinas, creation is not a change. It is rather a relation, a radical relation of dependency, of creature upon creator. So therefore, creation ex nihilo, from nothing, out of nothing, just is this radical relation by which God causes and sustains creatures at every moment they exist and at every moment they act, in the entirety of their being and their doing, such that God creates the world ex nihilo at every moment the world exists. At this moment, and every moment hereafter, the world is created ex nihilo. Aquinas puts it this way: but just as God has not only given being to things when they first began to exist, and also causes being in them as long as they exist, conserving things in being, as we have shown, so also he has not merely granted operative powers to them when they were originally created, but he always causes these powers in things. Hence, if this divine influence were to cease, every operation, read every activity, would cease, including the primary activity of existing. Therefore, every operation of a thing is traced back to him as its cause. And Steve brought this up in his talk. Having a beginning in time is utterly irrelevant to this radical relation. Even a temporally infinite cosmos would depend radically at every moment that it exists, which would be at every moment in time, for God. So imagine we would get into some sort of time bubble, right? And we would get back to what Steve called the imaginary singularity. So we go back to t equals 0. We put on, I don't know, the singularity goggles so we can see what's going on. And we're at the first moment of the Big Bang, the singularity. What we would see is just as much creation as I see right now. It would be no less creation as what you and I experience right now and at every moment. In fact, what we would be seeing is change, is the cosmos at the first stages of a series of changes that will eventually result in the cosmos that we have. So the simultaneous radical dependency at every moment is creation. And notice, this is why Aquinas calls God the cause of all causality. That creatures, we'll get into secondary causes in a second, that we are true causes, that every creature in the cosmos, and by the way, the term creature is as broad as the supposed, and I hear this theory is out nowadays, superstrings, should they exist, to creatures such as us, at every moment are dependent upon God. Well, now, what do creatures do? As it turns out, intracosmically, just about everything. But we do so by change, being the paradigmatic creaturely activity by which one creature, through its influence and causal efficacy, imparts one state of being to another. The thing is here, now it's there. And I'll show you how to scale this up and down and across. So Aquinas thinks of it this way, that what creatures do is bring out a new potential state of being in another creature in the cosmos. Aquinas famously thinks of all creatures as composites of a principle of potential he calls matter and a principle of actuality he calls form. And that everything in the cosmos is informed, therefore intelligible potential. Now, if every intracosmic creature is a composite of these things, and every intracosmic creature is a cause of these things, we are part of the explanation. Every creature is a part of the explanation why the outcomes in the cosmos are the outcomes that they are. Everything in the cosmos can be said to occur at the level of creaturely causality. Everything in the cosmos can be said, barring, of course, something like a miracle. And even in miracles, creatures can be used as instruments, well, I'll talk about in a second. So how do these two causal lines relate? The best way, a good way to think about this is something like a vertical and a horizontal axis. You might think of God's primary causality as something along the vertical axis, which would extend and probably better surround everything on the horizontal axis of creaturely causality at every moment. Now, if you look at it this way, both lines of causality are in principle non-competing because they are so radically different. In principle, creaturely causality is non-competing with divine causality, because the very reasons creatures exist and are causes is because of divine causality. So non-competing in principle. The causal lines are of a radically different order. A radically different order such that in the cosmos, what does God do? Everything. In the cosmos, what does a creature do? Everything. St. Thomas puts it this way. It is also apparent that the same effect is not attributed to a natural cause, i.e. a creature, and to divine power in such a way that it is partly done by God and partly by the natural agent. Rather, it is wholly done by both, according to a different way. Just as the same effect is wholly attributed to the instrument and also wholly attributed to the principal agent. As primary cause of all activity in the cosmos, on the vertical axis, you might put it this way, and many Thomists do. As primary cause of all that is, God is more interior to a creature than the creature is to itself. And in that way, in his transcendence, is more immanent to a creature, and to you and to me, for example, than we are to himself. Even in the miraculous, secondary causes, you might say, are just more passive instruments. where a secondary cause is empowered by supernatural power to achieve an effect that by nature it on its own could not achieve. So even in the miracle, miracles happen in and through creation by divine power, secondary causes are not excluded. Now, if you're following so far, let's now talk about the order of creation in terms of primary and secondary causality. And now a way to think about purpose in nature in this framework. So for St. Thomas, shocker, the cosmos is a fundamentally intelligible place. And beings and things in the cosmos are fundamentally intelligible. They give themselves up, sometimes tortuously and always generously, to our questions and to our inquiry. And he thinks of, in one way, the activities of creatures in terms of, and some of you have been trained in this kind of jargon, in what he calls final causality. So St. Thomas thinks that everything in the cosmos exhibits some sort of purpose. But you have to understand this in the way that he wants you to understand it so that we can clear up maybe a couple of confusions. So for St. Thomas, and we can, by the way, think of the squirrels running all around this campus. We'll pick on them again. It just turns out, and we all notice, that a squirrel being, if you look at it long enough, it manifests itself and it acts in generally regularly patterned ways for the most part. That squirrels, excuse me, we might say, exercise their squirrel causality. I mean, does that phrase ever come out of your mouth? Their squirrel causality. Why do they exercise it in such regular and focused ways? Such that we can understand in part, and in fragmentary ways, in fact, what a squirrel is, or I might phrase it this way, what it means to be a squirrel. It's precisely because its activity, for the most part, is regular and patterned and therefore intelligible. So for St. Thomas, anytime something in nature or a process in nature produces regular patterned outcomes, anytime a process in nature, after we've observed it enough, we make the judgment it tends to, for the most part, produce a said outcome. This is what he means by unintelligent nature being purposeful. Take any process, by the way, any process. So we can take something like, I don't know, we probably have some other people who know about natural family planning, this sort of stuff. So think of something like the menstrual cycle. So imagine if you were to ask, what is this process for? In fact, what is any process for? How would you know? What would you look at to make the judgment, to make the process intelligible? That regular and patterned outcome which it tends to produce. How one step is for the sake of another step, for the sake of some goal. And Aquinas thinks of purposes or goals in nature as multi-leveled, each step being for the sake of the one before. In a way, each step is a goal or an end of the previous. It even turns out that things in nature exhibit final causality in multiple ways. Some activities produce more than one regular outcome and therefore can be for multiple outcomes and multiple things. And you can scale this both up and down from micro to macro, and it becomes more difficult the more micro, by the way. So it is not completely incoherent to talk about final causality in terms of, say, the elements, and maybe even the different valence an element would have in a certain set of boundary conditions. On up the scale to talk about outcomes, meaningful outcomes, final causality, purposes in terms of natures, like our own, or the squirrel, for example. You can even scale it like we just did across, looking at different natures, or nature on different levels. On the level of, let's say, biological nature as a whole versus one instance of it in the particular, human nature. And in each case, you all know that there are certain sets of capacitating conditions if the outcomes are to be achieved, correct? And maybe even if the conditions are different, the characteristic outcomes may be different in virtue of the conditions or the environment. If we're talking about biological organisms, we might talk about ecological niche, etc. Now, the pivot for this is the idea of regular tendency. So I've been speaking this whole time about purpose. A Thomist would say analogically. Now, meaning you and I know we act with purpose all the time. Aquinas would say things in nature act with purpose. The similarity is regular tendency, or tendency toward regular patterned outcomes. This is the pivot of the analogy. And if you've noticed, I've used the phrase for the most part. So you see this in Aquinas and Aristotle all the time. Quote, always or for the most part. Even Aquinas knew in what he would have called the elements, that when you get to the micro, to the elements, and his construal of the elements is fairly radically different than ours, things tend to be always. And the regular outcomes have less variation, and we were going to say in a minute, less spontaneous. The more you move toward the organic, and even from universal to particular, the outcomes are more for the most part, not always. You might say spontaneity increases the more we move toward the organic, and for anybody who knows science, this is just an obvious fact. And the more you move toward the particular, the individual in individual cases, we move away from always and more solidly in the area of the most part. So you have to think of this in a nuanced, multi-leveled fashion. What will count will depend on each case, on what level of the cosmos, whether we're talking in a physical register, a biological register, or Karen, a planetary register. So as each case of the analysis, your talk of final causality will have to adjust, but with the principles remaining the same. It may even be that on a certain level of nature, the tendencies and intended outcome of nature is one thing, but on a more particular level of nature, it's different. So for example, let's think about biological nature in terms of mammals and mammals like us, just for a second. So, okay, we'll revisit this again at the end of the talk too. So if you were to look at, I talked about the menstrual cycle in a second. So if you were to look at all of these different features of reproductive biology, and even how that plays out in concrete persons, we might say on a broad level of biological nature, its intended outcome, and let's talk about human biological sexuality just for a second, is, well, the babies. So think of this. Now you might say, well, okay, on this level, nature doesn't much care. Do you follow? All she wants is reproduction. Do you follow? On the level of now the more micro and fine-grained human nature, this becomes a complicated thing. To then, the babies reproduce in a way that it's in accordance with a particular kind of nature, a human nature that is both animal and rational, that appreciates the aesthetic, that by nature wants to live with other people and craves community, politics, actually, and friendship. That now our nature is a whole different set of contours. If we were talking about bonobos, cute little sort of mini chimpanzees, what would be good for them may not necessarily be good for us. Because now we're talking about nature across the scale. On one level, nature's trying to achieve this. On a micro level, achieve that in a unique way, is the idea. Now, for St. Thomas, he sees nature as a kind of an ensemble, as something like, we might say, a coordinated ensemble of natures. It may be sort of odd to think of the cosmos as an ecosystem, but it's something to that effect. And in such a way that each part in this ensemble plays its part, because of its status as secondary cause. And on Aquinas, this status as a cause is the chief way created things show the divine likeness, reflect uncreated perfection. Therefore, if he has communicated his likeness as far as actual being is concerned to other things, by virtue of the fact that he has brought things into being, it follows he has communicated to them his likeness as far as acting is concerned, so that created things may also have their own actions. So to detract from the perfection of creatures is to detract from the perfection of divine power. The very perfection of a creature is primarily in its status as a real cause in the cosmos, and therefore as a part of real explanations of why nature is the way it is. You do, I do, God no favors by detracting from creaturely causality out of fear, concern, or anything else. To do so is actually against the divine majesty and not for it. So this is why a wonderful quote that Chris had up at the end of one of his talks. This is why we explain when nature is the question, we explain nature in its own terms. If it's a creaturely reality we are trying to explain, we explain it in creaturely terms, in terms of secondary causes. Now, the cosmos is a purposeful place, an ordered place, but in some ways not always so. So how does chance fit in? Now, the scholastic or Thomistic version of chance will be a bit different than we tend to think of chance. From our perspective, we could model just about anything from chance or by chance. What are the odds that? Even concerning what would be otherwise a purposeful thing in nature. Aquinas thinks of chance within this framework of purpose and order. A chance event for St. Thomas is just this. When two causal lines of creatures, up or down the scale, that are purposeful, tending toward a certain outcome, a characteristic outcome, an outcome that makes their nature intelligible. It's when they interact or intersect in such a way that they frustrate or impede one another. And what is produced is an outcome that is, quote, uncharacteristic, or, in this register, unintended. Those are the things that Aquinas says happen for the least part, or we might rather say, for the lesser part. And he says chance is a cause. He calls it an accidental cause, here meaning accidental as a non-essential cause. It's parasitic on creatures who act purposefully. It's a result of their activity, not an actual force in the cosmos, we might say. And even for St. Thomas, if God is the cause of all causality, God is the ultimate cause of chance and the chance interactions among creatures. And therefore, chance is not outside of God's providence in terms of primary causality. Perfectly valid from the creaturely perspective, you'll see, having no validity from the divine perspective. Now look, when I say chance is for the lesser part, that also depends on how you scale it. So think of it this way. I'm going to draw a force field you can't see, don't worry. So I put everybody here at about a 15 by 15 foot cube. And in this 15 by 15 foot cube, we will isolate up and down the scale every interaction, every nexus of cause and effect. Got it? With me so far? Let's say, I don't know, man, there's what? Let's be generous. Let's say there are 5 trillion iterations in our little force field box of cause and effect. Now, this would just be true. The vast majority of these would be able to put under the rubric of characteristic tendencies or outcomes. We might say on the micro, hydrogen going to do what hydrogen do, right? Et cetera, But there will also be chance outcomes where causal lines intersect and produce unintended results. For the sake of argument, and I'm making these numbers up sheerly gratuitously, let's just say, I don't know, let's say that only 1% of all causal iterations in our little cube are by chance for the least board. What's 1% of 5 trillion? Don't answer. We might say it this way: a whole hell of a lot. In other words, chance happens all the time. Chance occurrences happen all the time, as in a lot. But relative to the regular order of nature, for the lesser part, do you see? Actually, Steve, I'm pointing to him as if he's still on the screen. Steve told me this story once. So his father, one of the things he did was review books for some publication. And his dad was walking through the kitchen thinking of this old fantasy novel called The Worms of Ouroboros. Knock at the door. A dude shows up with a manila envelope. Inside is a copy of a new edition of The Worms of Ouroboros with a request from the magazine to review it. And you're like, what does it mean? Chance things happens all the time. You know, of course, in God's ultimate providence, it may be utterly profound, but at first glance, sometimes chance things just happen. But they happen more frequently and often than we think. Relative to. Very, very much operative in the cosmos. One other thing about chance. Predictability, or rather unpredictability, may be an oft feature of chance events. Inexplicability. For St. Thomas, neither of these are essential to chance. So let me take an example. It's my version of an example from Aristotle. So let's go back to ancient Greece, and we have a guy named Euthyphro. Euthyphro is going to the agora, the marketplace, to collect subscriptions for a religious festival. Euthyphro is a very religious guy. And then at the same time, a guy named Bophides goes to the market, and he wants to buy him a goat. Now, it just so happens that Euthyphro comes upon the goat stand, he sees Bophides, and he says, got him! Because it just so happens Bophides owes him money. Now look, from the perspective of Euthyphro and Bophides, this is a chance occurrence, an unintended occurrence, correct? Neither of them went to the market for this express purpose. It was outside of, beside, and in this case, especially Bophides, contrary to his intention. Times are tough. He just wants to buy a goat. Now, we could look at this sequence and explain it from the beginning to the end in causal terms. And we could come up with a sort of explanation why it occurred. But notice what could not be a part of our explanation: the intention of Bophides and the intention of Euthyphro. It could become perfectly intelligible in a certain fashion. But in that fashion, it happened for no reason, do you see? It happened for no reason. Even predictability. So let's say one of you is some sort of number savant, and you know these guys, you know Bophides, and you said, dude, I've checked the algorithms, I've run the numbers, and if you go to the market today, there is a 98.97% chance you will run into Euthyphro. Its predictability in that regard would make it no less a chance event. They may happen, these two things often accompany chance, but they're not essential to chance in this regard. And now Aquinas sees chance, which produces variety, by the way, as part of the overall order of nature. I want you to think of this in a biological register for a second, which we'll return to. In fact, it is chance that is part of the very engine, chance in this regard, these causal lines intersecting in ways that create this variety, is part of the very engine of evolution. You might say it is the engine of evolution. Now, remember, and we'll talk about this at the end, this will be part of and in the context of a larger order of nature. Now, the term exception is, if you took a logic class, would be called a relative term, meaning it has no cogent meaning unless it's related to its correlate, another relative term, the rule. Chance is only cogent given a cosmos that is ordered and regular for the most part. The very conception of chance in this regard is dependent upon a larger conception of purpose and order, to which, given the case, up or down across the scale, it is the exception to, or rather, an exception to. So, if you're following so far, we have now purpose, we have chance within a regular, greater order of purpose, and I'll show probably more fully how these things tend to interact. Oh, I got papers everywhere, people. So, think of it maybe this way. And we're now going to talk about Darwin for a minute. It seems to me to just be true that probably chance plays a greater role in the order of nature than Aquinas would have thought. In fact, plays a much greater role in the order of nature than Thomas would have even probably thought. Now, however, that it plays a greater role is no mark against thinking of or conceiving nature as purposeful. Remember, we have multi-levels. Aquinas, and in here I think he's probably mistaken. I know, he's probably mistaken. He has this phrase he inherits from Aristotle: nature always seeks what is best. That might depend on what level of nature you're talking about. If we're talking about biological nature, broadly speaking, nature seems to me to be happy with what's good enough. Do you follow? What's good enough? What works? However, on the case of particular nature, maybe not. Think of it this way. Let's go back to the squirrels, we could even use us as an example. If you want to know what a squirrel or a human being is, which specimens would you look at as most characteristic of what a squirrel is? Would you look at the janky, malnourished squirrel, poor fellow? Would you look at a human being with psychosis? You wouldn't. You would want to look at the most mature examples you can find of the kind. You would want to look at those examples of the kind where the capacities of their nature have been developed or are developed in such a way that we might say they are excellent members of their kind. They show us more fully what the thing is. So in one way, nature seeks after the good enough. But think in terms of human life, rational life. We might say the virtuous life. Its project is not the good enough. Its project is flourishing. What is best? Now, back to order and chance. So, if variation is this sort of engine that runs the biological, and this may be a very sloppy way of putting it, can we still see pattern? Can we still see purpose? Once again, it depends on how you scale it. Could it be, if we step back, and now we have the privilege of stepping back and looking at nature in our fragmentary way, where we might say the longue durée, the long duration of history, and we might be able to see or detect certain patterns. So let me give you an example from my own life. So my godfather, Uncle Larry, so from the time I was, I don't know, 5, 6, whatever, till I was like 20-something. Dude would slip me a 10 or a 20 every Christmas. All right? Every Christmas. Now, notice, him slipping me the 20, they weren't contiguous, really. They were actually 364 days apart, right? They were not connected. It's only because I have consciousness and a functioning memory that I can look and over a long period of time see the pattern. I can stand back and go, oh, this happens like clockwork until I was about 22, sad, every year, every Christmas. Every Christmas. So you might say, do you see and do we see in nature, and this is something that Dan's going to talk about in a talk later, do we see certain kinds of patterns for the most part? Well, maybe we do. So let's talk about nature again for a second. Let's just say if nature's project, talking about biological nature in general, we might say is the babies, is survival, is trying to solve, we might say, using analogies, the problem of life. It is interesting that in nature trying to solve the problem of life, only certain solutions will do given certain problems that an environmental niche might present. Aristotle once talked about nature. He says, quote, nature is like a doctor who doctors himself. And on the one hand, he says, art does not deliberate. So think of the doctor's art. If a guy's a doctor, the object of his art is to heal in some fashion or another. So he doesn't deliberate about that. What does he deliberate about? What's the best way to achieve the goal? And that depends on how more or less skilled he is, or what is dictated by problems on the ground in the patient. So art, in many ways, in face of the particular, is a troubleshooter, much like nature in the face of particulars is a troubleshooter. And it is interesting that in both the human being and the cephalopod, there was a certain problem that apparently only the camera eye could solve. That only the camera eye could solve, actually, and also in certain jellyfish-like creatures, too. There's a way in which nature is, and this is from Charles DeConnick, who I'm going to close with in a moment. He says, nature achieves her purposes something like a duck hunter does. So say, look, man, you're in the blind. I'm from South Louisiana. So you're in the duck blind. You got your gun. You're hunting, I don't know, teal, whatever. You got some number 6s in there. And you're using a shotgun because you have this package of pellets. And you were using essentially chance and randomity to achieve a goal. I shoot, and depending on what kind of choke I have, it controls the pattern of the pellets. I want that pattern, given distance, to be both as big as possible. I only need one pellet to do the job, do you see? Only one. There's a way in which this is how nature, and we have a better idea of this than St. Thomas did, achieves her goals. Using randomity, using chance in order to affect certain things. If we had a different occasion and a longer time, there's even a way from this perspective you could construct a sort of argument, not a scientific argument by any means, but a philosophical argument in this register, that one of the reasons for nature's being is to produce something like us. However, the way she does is not for the philosopher to find out. That is for the biological scientist to find out. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, the end is given in advance, let's just say. That doesn't mean the necessary troubleshooting means are given in advance. And it's in this way, so variety, produced by chance in the larger order of nature, produces all sorts of things. Things deleterious, things frustrating, things useful, things fortunate. Remember, the chance meeting was good for Euthyphro, bad for Bovides. All sorts of variation. You people in biology probably know this number with more precision than I do. It's something like 99 point, fill in the number, % of species, as they would be scientifically accounted for, that have ever existed are extinct. The overwhelming vast majority of kinds of things, kinds as defined by science, not in a philosophical register, no longer are the so-called evolutionary dead ends. from this perspective, not dead ends at all. For St. Thomas, chance is good because if everything acted with perfect regularity, there would be less variety in nature. And therefore, the divine goodness would not be manifested in ways that it could otherwise be manifested. There's a way in which, from this perspective, nature is essentially magnificent. I mean magnificent in a particular way. The ancient virtue. So magnificence was a kind of justice in Aristotle. So it's when, some kind of Greek aristocrat citizen would share his great wealth, throwing a party, this kind of stuff, tastefully done always. In Cicero, it's doing great things for the political community. It's a kind of generosity. So seen in this way, precisely because as secondary causes, creatures have their own spontaneity and therefore do fail in perfect regularity. It's a failure, but it's a function of nature's generosity. It's nature trying to mirror and manifest the divine goodness in every way she possibly can. But look, y'all, and you know it just as well as I do, this is a two-edged sword, double-sided coin, pick your metaphor. St. Thomas talks about nature achieving her purposes, and he compares the material of nature to iron. So let's talk about the iron of nature for a minute. So there's a reason we make, and we're thinking of the Middle Ages, we don't have stainless yet. You want to make a blade with iron. It's better than bronze for sure. So it's hard. It can be shaped, so it's not too hard. It can be made to keep an edge. See, that's true, my phone dinged. To keep an edge. But it's got its drawbacks as the kind of material it is. It rusts. It dulls. So with what nature has to work with, she doesn't always achieve her ends because her capital, her means of production, is limited and it is finite. But no matter how limited, how finite, she is still generous, and she is precisely generous as secondary cause. To be theological for one moment, and then I will close. We as Catholics tend to think of the created order as a sacramental order. Every creature is somehow and in some way, and even in one creature in various ways, a carrier of meaning of the uncreated. So every creature is a carrier of meaning, something sacramental in this fashion. It is sacramental precisely because it's a cause, a true cause. A word on sacraments. That water is water and has to be water and maintain the properties of water is what makes it a vector for baptismal grace. You can't baptize with 10W30. Bread and wine. When we receive the Lord in the Eucharist, whenever wine ceases to be wine and bread ceases to be bread, Christ is no longer present. So for creation to be a sacrament, it has to have its own integrity as nature. So to vitiate nature and its causality in any way is to also rob the cosmos of its sacramentality. And I have to tell you, there are many Christians who do this, knowingly or unknowingly. I will let the great Thomist who was taken way too early, and Chris has actually mentioned him in a talk, Charles de Connick, and I will let him have the last word from what's, for my money, the best Thomist encounter with modern science. It's an unfinished book called The Cosmos. And de Connick says this: let us say there are two ways in which scholastics, let's insert Christians, have sought to honor the Creator. The one consists in diminishing as much as possible the causality of the creature. That is, quote, the idea in the back of the mind of those authors who are called creationists. This is in 1936, by the way. They want us to think that it takes a special creative act for the production of each natural and biological species, as is the case with angelic species and the human form. He means the soul. They denied the scientists the right to derive biological species, the one from the other. At the other extreme is found the Thomistic tendency, inspired by St. Augustine, which enriches as much as possible the causality of the creature, not with the goal of eliminating creative intervention, but in order to increase it. For the creative power, envisaged from the side of its effect, is most profoundly at work where created causes are most causes. The more the creature does it, the more God does it. The more a creature is capable of acting, the more it manifests the power of its ultimate cause, for God is the cause of all causality. From this point of view, He is much more profoundly the cause of our free acts than we are ourselves. If we have a dread of spirit which animates creationism, this is because it is not creationist enough. In the final instance, it is a form of occasionalism. Thank you for listening.